Hello, I'm Rita McCarthy, and for this Decade of Centenary commemoration, I'm going to tell the story of the County Clare Nursery, as it was called. And the County Clare Nursery was a mother and baby home that operated between 1922 and 1932. And it was a mother and baby home for the whole of County Clare. It was based in Kilrush, but it was for the whole of County Clare. And the picture I'm looking at here is of Portumna Workhouse, which I took fairly recently. But it does give you an indication of what it might have been like, even though I think it probably was a lot better than what the actual County Clare Nursery in Kilrush was like. Now, before I start, I just want to tell you my sources, basically. My main sources for this are the County Clare Board of Health minute books, the Kilrush Board of Guardians, and the newspapers of the day, the Clare Champion and the Saturday Record. I'm actually going to start at the end of my presentation. I'm going to introduce you to a man called Jimmy King. Now, Jimmy was born in the County Clare Nursery. The photograph I have here was taken in August, just a couple of months ago, when I met Jimmy just very close to where I am now at the Temple Gate Hotel. And we had it's one of many long conversations we've had about the County Clare Nursery and really about Jimmy's life.
My name is Jimmy King. I was born on the 23rd of November 1931 in Kilrush, in the nursing home there. I was transferred from there some 4 months later in March 1932 with 10 or 11 other babies to Sean Ross Abbey in Rosscree, County Tipperary. Next thing I remember is that I'm transferred or fostered, or the term that I detest, boarded out, to foster parents. I had a happy childhood insofar as physically, mentally. From a very young age, I was troubled about my fact that I didn't have a mother and father. I knew that I was looked down on, as were several others that were in the same parish. And
Jimmy, if you could have one wish now, what would it be?
To find out exactly the situation when I was born in the nursing home in Kilrush, and about my mother. Would she tell me who father was? Or could someone tell me?
And that is something that to this day Jimmy wants to know. He'll be 90 in November, and he is still interested in trying to find as much about his background as possible. He has met some relatives on his mother's side, and he has had great experiences with them. He is coming home to Ireland to celebrate his birthday in November, so he is a very happy and contented man in many ways, but he does want to know the answer to this. And Jimmy is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this. I started to research the County Clare Nursery by accident. I came across it when I was doing an MA, and I was fascinated that such an institution was so close to where I was from. I'm from Kilrush, and the actual nursery was based in Kilrush. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background of it. So before I start, I just want to say something about language, and language matters. Now, Jimmy makes that clear in what he says, how words can hurt. And for the purpose of historical accuracy, I will use the term used at the time: illegitimate, inmate, first offender, second offender, repeat offender, boarded out, the home, etc. I would like to say that I would only ever use these words in historical context. They do have an effect and an impact on the people who hear them and who connect with them. So to go right back to the start, the first Darlin took place on the 21st of January 1919. And this was a provisional government. It was almost a government on the run. It was a Sinn Féin government, and they set up almost in parallel to the British administration. And one of their, they had a programme for government, and one of their key elements of that programme for government was poor law reform. And Cathal Brugha, on the day of that first Dáil, stood up and said, "The Irish Republic fully realises the necessity of abolishing this present odious, degrading and foreign poor law system. It shall be the first duty of the Government of the Republic to make provision for the physical, mental and spiritual well-being of the children, to secure that no child shall suffer hunger or cold from lack of food, clothing or shelter, but that all shall be provided with a means and facilities requisite for their proper education and training as citizens of a free and Gaelic Ireland." Now that was an incredibly worthwhile and important aspiration, but it would take many, many years before it would come to pass. Once the treaty had been signed in December 1921, this new government set about putting its programme of government into place, and it tackled ending the poor law. Now, in 1913, a vice-regal commission had come up with the idea of closing the workhouses. The workhouses were a key element of the poor law system. The people who couldn't, the vulnerable, the weak in society, who couldn't or didn't have the means to look after themselves, were sent to the workhouse. It was, it had incredible stigma about it. And for the purpose of this, we're going to talk mainly about single unmarried mothers and their children who were classed as illegitimate. And they would have been one of the groups who were sent to the workhouse. The other part of the Vice-Regal Commission, the recommendation, was the setting up of county homes for the sick and the old. Now, the new government looked at this as a local government issue. So instead of looking at nationally, they looked at it locally, and each county council was tasked with coming up with their own system of caring for the vulnerable in their particular communities. Now, County Clare came up with a slightly different, in many ways, system to other counties. There were one of two similar, but really it was kind of out on its own in many ways, and it was called the County Clare Amalgamation. On the 14th of December, Clare County Council sent a letter to all the Board of Guardians to close the workhouses. Pretty much as soon as the treaty had been signed, that was one of their first acts, was to get the workhouses closed. So you can see how important it was. And on the 29th of December, Kilrush, and I would say every other Board of Guardians, that was the only one I saw the record of, sent a letter back acceding to all the instructions. Now, what that meant was that the county home was set up in what was Ennis Workhouse. So all the old and infirm from all over the county, from Kilrush, from Scariff, from Corofin, from Ennistimon, they were all moved into Ennis Workhouse. The slightly different option then the County Clare did was it separated out unmarried mothers and their illegitimate children, and also deserted and orphan children. And they created a separate institution, and they put this into Kilrush. And this was in part of Kilrush Workhouse. I suppose the only people that this impacted straight away were the people who were existing in these institutions. So, for instance, the elderly, really, wherever they were from, they were now moved to Ennis, and very little was said about it at the time. The Clare Champion did an interview with someone in Kilrush. I think it seemed to have been just a quick interview, and the person he interviewed was someone from Kilrush Workhouse, and he said the poor inmates are bitterly complaining against their removal away from their kith and kin, whom they will probably never see again. And that was on the 7th of January that was reported, and that was absolutely true. They were never going to see them again, because really, if you lived in, I'll give an example as Kilrush, if you lived in Kilrush, if you were in Kilrush Workhouse and your family were in Dunbeg or Kilkee, chances are they might be able to see you at some point. But with no transport, lack of roads, and remember the people who were in the workhouse, their families weren't well off either, so they had no means really of seeing people again. There was also the issue of burial. The workhouse had the system in later years of working with the families and burying the person who was in the workhouse in the family plot. but that would now be gone as well. And people were terrified of the idea of a pauper's grave. So that was the issue for the elderly and the weak, but little was said about it at the time. The unmarried mothers then, they were moved into Kilrush. So if there were young women who had children recently in, we'll say, Innis Workhouse, and I found one record of one who had, they were moved back into Kilrush, into part of the existing workhouse. And also pregnant women who were coming into these institutions to have their babies and had nowhere else to go, they were moved directly now into Kilrush. The other thing that happened was children who were in the workhouses were boarded out from the age of 6. Prior to that, they had been boarded out from the age of 10. So now, from the age of 6, you were boarded out and your guardian was paid 7 and 6 a week, which was, you know, for some families that would have made a lot of difference to them. But what kind of difference it might have made to the children, that's another story. Okay, the photograph I'm looking at now is a very old photograph. It's from the 1900s and I downloaded it from the workhouse.org website. And it's of Kilrush Workhouse, and it's the only one that I know of in existence. And I would love if somebody found another one, because it's not a great one. You can see the workhouse right at the very back of the photograph. And what you have in the foreground are a lot of ladies walking, and men and women really, and they're dressed in the hats and of that kind of early 1900 Edwardian period. And they're in a procession, and I think it's probably the Corpus Christi procession, which was always a big procession in Kilrush in June. I could be wrong, but I would imagine that it is that. If not, it's something similar. So we can see the workhouse, this domineering building on a hill at the back. And I have an arrow there pointing to, I think, the area where the actual mother and baby home was situated. So now we're going to really just talk about the County Clare Nursery. And how it was run first and foremost. And this again is interesting, and this differs slightly, well, this differs a lot from other institutions. It was owned and run by Clare County Council, that would have been as everywhere else, and it came under the remit of the County Clare Board of Health. And they set up a subcommittee, and this shows a certain amount of progressiveness as well. Remember, this is 1922, we were at the beginning of our new Free State. And there certainly were people who had progressive ideas lurking around somewhere. And they proposed that 2 ladies and 2 doctors would sit on the subcommittee to run the nursery, so that they wouldn't necessarily be counsellors. They would be made up of some counsellors, but that people would be brought in to give their expertise and their help in running the nursery. Now, the day-to-day running of the nursery, the actual running of it, was by the Sisters of Mercy from Kilrush. Now, they had been in the workhouse from around about 1875, so it was more a kind of continuation of the care that they were already giving in the workhouse. They were there from 1922 until 1928 only. And I'll talk now about the other organisation that had a huge control over the County Clare Nursery, and that was the Department of Local Government and Public Health. And they were a centralised body, and they would have had control over all of these institutions, but they took a particular interest in Kilrush because it was run by the County Council. It wasn't part of a religious institution. It was a new system. They had separated it out from the county home as well. So it was kind of a new system. They closely monitored everything, from staffing levels to the rations that were given to the women and children there. And there are many... They did this through standing orders and instructions that were then read into the County Clare Board of Health minutes, and these were then passed on. So this was a very tight control here. The Sisters of Mercy, as I said, were there until 1928, and the reason they left was because, and again, you know, this shows the progressive thinking in many ways. The department wanted trained nurses. They wanted qualified nurses. And whilst the nuns had an awful lot of experience, they didn't have qualifications as nurses. And there was continuous back and forth between the County Council and the department about this for years, basically. They wanted trained nurses in there. In 1928, the nuns, after one particular break up with the department, they left, and they were replaced then by nurses, by lay nurses who came in. This slide here shows a staff breakdown, and it just gives you an idea of who was there. So the first person who's mentioned here is the chaplain, and he was Father McInerney, the parish priest in Kilrush, and he was paid £45 a year for his troubles as the chaplain. The next person who's mentioned is the porter, and he was actually the best paid. He was paid £104 every year. And next to that then are the nuns. This was in 1925 when they were still there, and they were each paid £60 a year. Then there were various attendants who looked after the children, and their wages decreased, basically. The least was £36, and that was from a lady who looked after school children. Now, the main issue with the county, there were many issues with the County Clare Nursery. The building itself. Reports even long before it had became the County Clare Nursery talked about the poor conditions in Kilrush Workhouse. I mean, it was the notorious workhouse from famine times. Of course, that was in the past, but it was still in poor condition. It was a poor building, basically. And County Clare, the Board of Health actually asked a man called James Lysett, who was a local government inspector, and they asked him if he would do a report on all the institutions they now had responsibility for. And I'm going to read now a little bit of what he said about the nursery. This is, remember, in 1922, and he said, "It was a perfect scandal to have anybody there. There was no sanitary accommodation and no proper water supply. In view of the prevailing conditions, they would give rise some time or other to an outbreak of fever for which the County Board of Health would be responsible." So right there, right at the beginning, he went on to recommend that it be closed. So that was James Lysett's take on the County Clare Nursery as early as 1922. Now, the County Clare Nursery subcommittee sent a proposal to the department in 1922. And again, we can see how they were thinking and their aspirations and hopes maybe for what could be done. And they asked that a bathroom and a lavatory be installed, a labour ward and a small isolation unit. And again, it shows, an isolation unit would have been very important because any outbreak of disease, as we're very aware of now, would have been a way of controlling it. Unfortunately, they also made a proposal with the district hospital. They asked for a water supply and a sewerage and sanitary system. So none of these were in Kilrush at that time. Now, that wasn't unusual, it wasn't the only town, but it was a huge problem here. And because of this, the horror starts to unfold pretty early on. Now, I have two photographs here. One is, both of them were taken in Portumna, and Mary Healy gave me one and I took one. And this is of the beds in Portumna workhouse, and every workhouse was pretty much the same. So what you see here is pretty much what have been in Kilrush, and this is from one of the women's wards. There's also a little fireplace there with a fire guard. This was in the nursery in Portumna, and this would have been the source of heat, and this would have been the source of heat in Kilrush. But on top of that, in Kilrush, you had a leaking roof, you had water running down the windows, you had broken windows, you had a horrendous situation. And the matron sent a report in to the subcommittee and the Board of Health every month, and she reported on what was happening. And this really is one of our main sources of knowledge about the County Clare Nursery. And in April 24, she said, "There are 164 inmates in the nursery, and the children are sleeping 2 in a bed with every habitable corner occupied." In September 1925, she said, "The flooring around the walls requires urgent attention as rats have come through the holes and the children are in great danger." In March 1927, Dr. Coonahan himself sent a letter directly to the Department of Local Government and Public Health. Dr. Coonahan was the medical officer for all of West Clare, and this would have come under his remit. And he said, "It was impossible for him to be responsible for the health of the children, considering the conditions under which they live, and the death rate was appalling." I suppose that puts paid to the lie sometimes that comes up when you hear these kind of stories, that, that was the way it was back then and everywhere was the same. These are the people themselves speaking from back then, saying this was unacceptable. The Saturday Record in 1931, this is not long before it closed. The numbers had decreased because they were moving people at this point. They said there are now 61 patients and the buildings are in a very bad state of repair with leaking roofs, no baths, no inside sanitary accommodation. So for the 10 years of existence, there would have been, at different times you can see things like the engineer said it would cost £5 to mend the roof or whatever. So there were little bits of patch-ups done to try and keep it. But there was no electric light, there was no water, there was nothing. So you can imagine this is a perfect storm waiting to happen, really. And it did. So who came to the mother and baby home? Who came to the County Clare Nursery? So it was mothers. As I said, there were also older children there from the days of the workhouse, and there were children who were deserted, who found their way there as well, and children who were orphaned. But really, this is about the mothers who came there and to have their babies and their babies that were born there, as much as anything. These were the majority of those who were in there. And again, it's very hard to find anything good said about the mothers. And I've gone through an awful lot of reports and looked at an awful lot of things. There were pregnant, unmarried women from all over County Clare. That's the first thing to be said. They were from every parish in County Clare. The baptismal records, there were baptismal records kept by Kilrush, and every baptism that was registered gave the mother's parish of origin and the mother's name, basically, and a little bit more information about the babies. But that tells us a bit. The other records that we can look at are the death certificates for the babies, and they are now online and can be looked, and I'm in the process of going through them at the moment. I have done one look through and come up with some figures, but I'll be kind of going back over that again. Until 1924, the women didn't have to stay for any length of time. There was a lot of debate about this. The subcommittee in the beginning felt that it would discourage women from coming in to have their babies if they had to stay for a length of time. But gradually that changed, as did the subcommittee. In 1923, the subcommittee was made up of women and, as I said, 2 priests and county councillors and urban councillors. By 1928, it was made up of all male county councillors. So it had changed, and you can draw your own conclusions from that. The only report, the women were referred to as the reports, the matron's reports, the doctor's reports, all of the reports, even from county councillors who visited at different times. They referred to the women, first of all, as inmates, that was the term, first offenders, second offenders, repeat offenders, but then they described their behaviour. And I never read anything good, really. It was always they were incorrigible, they were disobedient, they were insubordinate. They rebelled. Now, these women did stand up for themselves on some occasions. They were expected to work whilst they were there, and they had to work in the laundry, in the hospital across the road from the nursery, the district hospital as it was then in Kilrush, and they were expected to work hard. And one in particular refused point blank to work. And she was subject to a strange punishment. She was sent to the county home, and the ambulance brought her one morning, and there was nowhere for her in the county home, so she came back in the evening. So she escaped that punishment anyway. The only thing I ever saw, the only report I've seen is one that was sent to the Department of Local Government and Public Health. And this is in their files, actually. And it says, the mothers are neglected. And this was about the mothers in Kilrush. The mothers are neglected. They have no proper clothing and no comfort of any kind. They are willing to do any work, even the most menial and unpleasant. So this kind of is the only time where you can get a sense of any compassion coming from the powers that be with regard to the women who were in there. And if you look to the right here, I have a chart. And the chart is taken from, the data in this is taken from the records. And I have to acknowledge the man that helped me with this, who put some of this together for me, Simon Wilson. Anyway, the chart shows the occupations of the mothers. And this looks at only 182 records. These were the death certificates I looked at. And of that, 121 of the women were servants. Another 6 were noted as labourers. 19 were said to be labourer's child. And I can't be sure whether that means the child, the baby that was born, was the mother was a labourer or was it she was a labourer's child. It's difficult to see. It's given as mother's occupation. There are also some farmers' child, there's foundlings, there's deserted, and these are all the death records. These are the children that died. There's one which is interesting, a travelling showman. And I was thinking how this could be, and I was thinking maybe he was in Kilrush in a show and his wife went into labour and had the baby in Kilrush and the baby died. But anyway, it's the death certificate that is there. So this tells us really these were people who, once they were pregnant, they weren't wanted wherever they were working. How they got pregnant is, another story. We can draw again, we have no actual facts, but we can draw some conclusions. I did come across one note from a mother to the Board of Health in Ennis where she said that if they wanted to get upkeep for her, if they wanted to claim upkeep for her daughter and her daughter's child, they should go to the man she worked for, and she gave his name and address. But I don't think necessarily that was all. We can't kind of draw anything from that, too much from it, but certainly it's an interesting statistic that 121 of the 182 were servants. Once they were pregnant and I suppose beginning to show, they were then moved on, basically. They weren't wanted at home. Usually these were people who came from poor backgrounds. They probably couldn't afford to look after them. There was also the shame, and shame is the thing that is always at play in these situations. What would the neighbours say? The shame of it. What would the church say? What would the priest say? What would the parish say? So the shame was also a part of it. It is a big part of it. So they found refuge in Kilrush in one way. What kind of refuge? That's another story. Now the babies, so the women had their babies there, and again we have two sources of records, the baptismal records and the death certificates, and unfortunately there were all too many of them. The baptismal record gave the mother's name, the baby's date of birth and the date he was baptised, the parish, and also beside each one that was born in the nursery was extramarital born in home. So this would be there forever and is there forever, because I've gone through the records and seen every one of those records. In total, 330 baptisms were registered, but this is not all the babies that were born, because some of the babies died shortly after birth, and they may not have been able to arrange a baptism with a priest. So what may have happened, and I don't know this, but they may have been baptised at the bedside by a nun or whatever, but certainly they recorded them because they were recorded in death certificates. So, where babies died maybe an hour after birth or a couple of days after birth. Now, the first baby born in Kilrush was a baby called James. He was born on the 9th of February 1922, and his mother's parish was 6 Mile Bridge. And the last baby born in Kilrush was born on the 21st of February 1932, and he was named Gerard, and he was from the parish of Ennis. Now, an interesting thing about the baptismal records, I've had contact with a lot of people who are trying to find information about maybe not so much themselves, but about a parent or a grandparent. And going through the baptismal records, I found as well where adults wrote back to Kilrush for a record of their baptism. So if they were getting married somewhere else, and they wrote from all over the world. Some of these babies grew up to be adults who lived in Sydney, in Boston, in New York, in London, in Bristol, as well as all over Ireland. So some of them did carry on and make lives. They would write back for the baptismal certificate. And a little while back, I was contacted through somebody else who knew I was doing this work by a woman in New York. And her father had been born in the County Clare Nursery. He as well was fostered, same as Jimmy, and he had worked near Ennis as well. He was born there in 1925, and he lived in Ireland till he was about 20, and then he moved to the States, and he joined the army in America, and he fought in Korea, and he rose to the rank of sergeant. He came back and lived in New York. He worked in Safeways, which was a supermarket there, and she also said he was a wonderful carpenter. And she went on to say that he was a very loving and kind man, but he never ever spoke about his childhood. It simply wasn't something he talked about. He died in 2009 and he was 83 years of age at the time. So, you know, it was nice to hear that story. And it was like meeting Jimmy. It brought some of this to life. It made the people very real to hear this. Now, the other side of this was the illness and death side of it. And this was where it becomes much more problematic and difficult, really. This is, again, a report from the Clare Champion in 1927. And it says, at one time, the death rate in the nursery was so high that special precautions had to be taken to protect them. 2 nurses had to be hired to watch them day and night. Now, as I said, I've gone through 182 death certificates. Now, not all of these babies were actually born in the nursery as well. I have to be clear on that. Some of these were children who were born and maybe brought into the nursery, maybe after they were born, or maybe in some cases, because they couldn't get into the hospital, maybe they brought them into the nursery as well. So it's just to be clear on that. But more than 182, I definitely think the figure is higher. Of the 330 babies that were baptised, so we saw that particular group, I did a cross-check of 2 databases basically, and of that, more than 30% died. And that unfortunately included baby James, the baby who was the first baby born there. He died in June 1924 from TB, and he was aged 2¼ years. Now, the causes of death. So this is the illnesses they died from more so than the causes of death, I suppose. But yeah, debility from birth. Of the 182 that we looked at, and again, I have to thank Simon Wilson and Caroline Wilson for help with this. But of the 182 that we looked at, 85 died from something which was called debility from birth. And debility from birth, when you look it up, it's really, I suppose it's obvious, it's a failure to thrive. The child is unable to, it doesn't develop, it doesn't seem to be able to develop as a normal child would. And we can look in a minute at other reasons for that. Another high reason for death was something called marasmus. And marasmus was basically malnutrition. So the children weren't they weren't receiving enough food to survive. That's really what that's about. Gastroenteritis was very high. And that goes back to what we said earlier on, the lack of any isolation. And you know, if you have 2 children in a bed, which they were in 1924, and 1924 was one of the highest records of deaths. So you can see why this will happen. Whooping cough, again, all of these things are virulent. TB. Influenza. Now there's whooping cough is down here twice really because peritosis is also whooping cough. So cardiac failure, debility from birth might also be the root cause, but there would be other reasons then. They might die from pneumonia or from, they couldn't fight off anything. They simply didn't have the strength to thrive. So all of these little babies were there in pretty bad circumstances, and their inability. Their mothers were there to nurse them, to breastfeed them, but unfortunately the mothers weren't nourished enough to be able to feed the children. This is another record that I've looked at, and this is the Central Statistics Office. This is the deaths of illegitimate children under 2 born in institutions in Clare. So it doesn't say the County Clare Nursery, but bearing in mind that the County Clare Nursery was the only institution, the official institution. There may have been some in the county home at different times, but this was the official institution. And babies under 2 born in institutions, illegitimate, were a total of 168. So again, a very high number. And it breaks it down year by year there. So what were the actual causes? Why did so many of these babies die? And I suppose what I showed you at the beginning, the conditions in the nursery had a huge impact on it. Lack of sanitation or running water, lack of isolation, lack of an isolation ward, meaning children were in close contact, lack of nutritious food. In 1924, again, Dr. Coonan had to write to the department and ask for an increase in rations for the mothers because they weren't able to feed their children. So that will tell you. Now, that was in 1924. In 1927, he wrote again about the conditions. And he talked about the appalling death rate. That was, I think, in March or April 1927. And I think in June 1927, the department wrote to the Board of Health in Clare County Council demanding that the rations be reduced, that they hadn't approved the rations. So again, that shows you as well, not just the level of control that there was from that particular central section. That really does need further investigation. Now, there also has to be said there was a high mortality rate in children in the wider community. And I kind of did a look through some of this. I looked at 1924, which was a bad year. In the nursery, there was something like 38 deaths registered through the death certificates. But in the wider West Clare, I suppose it would be the electoral district, which would be Kilrush, Kilkee, Dombeg, Kilmahel, down really to Knock, all that area. There were a total of 31 deaths. Now, a lot of those deaths as well, that was high number too, but that is in the whole electoral area. The 38 deaths take place in one institution, in one place, and that is an institution that is under the care of a Board of Health in the council and also a department, as well as the people who are there trying to run it. And many of the children who died outside that year, they died of whooping cough. And a lot of them had no medical attention. But presumably there was medical attention of some kind anyway available for the children in the nursery. But it certainly didn't seem to improve in any way their chances. You can compare like for like, and it has been said to me, oh, you know, these were terrible times, poverty. That's very true. There's no denying that fact. But you still can't excuse it on that grounds. And I think the comments from the staff working there actually support that. The building itself was a death trap, really. It was leaking, the leaking roof, rats coming through the skirting boards, damp, broken windows, freezing cold. You know, so this was, and the next slide we look at, we'll talk about, you know, one particular case. That's just what I have here as well is something that Dr. Coonahan did write in 27, where again he says it to the Department of Local Health, of Local Government and Public Health, that he was not going to be held responsible for the children. The death rate was appalling. This is the actual piece that was in the minute books. Now, one tragic death was Mary Sherlock, and Mary was born in January 1926. Her mother was Annie, and Annie was 19 when she went into Kilrush to have Mary. And it was a very cold year, and Annie got up to feed Mary very early one morning, and she took her into the bed to feed. And a lot of the girls were doing this, even though it was frowned upon strictly. And this was something that appeared as an infringement by the mothers in the matron's report. They're taking the children into the beds. But they were doing it because it was so cold there. But she took her into the bed to nurse, and unfortunately she fell asleep. And she obviously rolled over, and Mary died. Mary was smothered, basically. And Annie woke up screaming, and she jumped out of the bed, and one of the other girls was there. Around 9 o'clock, she jumped out, and she shouted that Mary was dead, Mary was dead. And the nurses came, the nurse that was on duty came, and she was, you know. So in those days, inquests were held very quickly afterwards, and an inquest was held in Kilrush. And a jury would sit at the inquest. And there would be someone representing the state, and of course the medical officer, the doctor, would give his report. And Dr. Coonahan gave his report at the inquest. And he said he'd examined the baby and he'd found no bruises or marks of violence. He said the body was well nourished. He concluded that Mary had died from smothering or asphyxia. Other witnesses came, including one of the girls who was there with her on the morning, and one of the nurses who was in attendance. And it was the nurse who said, it's the habit of the girls to take the babies in because the building is so cold. And she said that Mary had screamed that the baby was dead, and they also said that that Anne was a very loving mother. Unfortunately, that didn't satisfy Sergeant Geary, who was the sergeant, the state's representative at the inquest. And he asked that Anne be charged with Mary's death, basically. And that was reported on the 7th of April. It's there for anyone to see in the Saturday Record on the 7th of April 1926. Now the case didn't, I don't think, went any further, because really he had no case. But he was unhappy with the finding of the inquest, and he wanted her charged. And she was taken to the barracks in Kilrush and charged, but it didn't go further. I never found a record of a court case or anything like that. I found Anne's name again later, working in the workhouse in Ennis, and she did eventually leave there. So that's it. I've a photograph I've put with this is again taken by Mary Healy in Portumna, and it's a candle lit in the window of the nursery in Portumna. So I just kind of put it with it in memory of Mary and her sad little life. I'm coming to the end now, basically. So we're talking about really what was it all about, and it's always all about money, isn't it? It's the economy, you know, as Bill Clinton famously said. The cost of running the County Clare Nursery was a source of terrible debate among county councillors throughout its existence, and all of these debates are there if you want to go and look at the newspapers. The Clare Champion reported in a report noted that the cost of running the nursery for 1922 and 1923 was £8,201. This was a cost, it was a draw, and this is what really the value that was put on the people was really the cost that they were to the council and to the state. In 1927, one councillor, there are so many of these debates, but I've just picked out a couple. One councillor likened the cost of keeping the women and children as akin to keeping able-bodied men in the mental hospital, as their families would not accept responsibility for them. I suppose, you know, you could say he had a point, but the fact is, it shows a searing lack of any compassion. And I suppose that's what comes through pretty much all the time, is a lack of compassion for the women, the children, and in this case, the men who were in the mental home. In 1930, of course, fathers, had a role to play, but they were very hard to track down. And in 1932, the Illegitimate Children's Act empowered institutions to go after fathers. And Clare County Council did, and they tried 3 or 4 times, but with limited success, because how could it was the word of a mother, of a woman who was classed as sometimes a repeat offender, as someone with loose morals. Wicked ways was often referred to, a woman with wicked ways, and she was maybe coming up against a more respectable member of the community, or any member of the community. All he had to say was no. It was her word against his. So it was very difficult to pursue. I think I came across one where the father did pay 5 shillings a week after being taken to court. That was pretty much it. There were cases, though, where the fathers did, and this is sometimes recorded in the baptismal records. One father contacted his parish priest, who contacted Kilrush to say he would look after, he would marry the girl and take the baby. But he was living in Tuam, and he couldn't afford for her to be sent to Tuam. He couldn't afford the rail fare, and that was how they travelled. So what happened was the ambulance brought her and the baby from Kilrush to Ennis, and they paid the rail ticket for her from Ennis to Tuam. So presumably they made it through their life. They were together anyway. Closure came. It was inevitable. From day one they'd wanted to close it. The decision to close was based on economics. There was no money forthcoming from the department for capital spending. In 1929, the secretary to the Board of Health contacted Bessborough and Tuam. These were new style mother and baby homes, and they found that they could do it cheaper. So they began the process of trying to move the services out of Clare and into these places. The minutes note that 5 offenders were first offenders. The problem with these institutions is they wouldn't take repeat offenders. Whereas in Kilrush, women did come back more than once. But in either in Tuam, Bessborough, or their final destination for Kilrush, Shanross Abbey, they wouldn't take repeat offenders, as I said. So then there was the problem, what would you do if you did go to one of these? You could send the babies, but you couldn't send the mothers. So one of the councillors was adamant that the mothers would be sent to a Magdalen laundry. And the convent in the Good Shepherd in Limerick was contacted, but again they wouldn't take other than first offenders. They would take the women but not the babies, so the babies could then be sent to one of the other institutions. So in the end, the department intervened, and they recommended this time that children be sent to Shanross Abbey in a new institution in Roscrea in Tipperary. And this came to pass in 1931. That instruction came from the department to Board of Health, and they passed it on to Kilrush. And that was really what happened. Up to a notification came from the Reverend Mother to say that she would accept the following week, this was in March 1932, she would accept the following week 25 children at a price of 10 shillings a child. If the mother was a first offender, they could accompany them, but if they were classed as a second offender or had any strikes against them, they were well, basically what happened was they were released into the community. They were, and when I say released, that's exactly what it was. They were in prison in Kilrush, really. They couldn't leave. From 1924, they couldn't leave. Some of these women tried to go over the wall to escape. They were returned by the guards. They were in a locked gate. They were behind a locked gate. So now at least they were continue with their lives, but they had to separate their lives from their babies' lives and their children's lives. And we can only imagine the grief and pain that caused. We do hear a little bit of it from Jimmy about his lack and his sense of abandonment from his mother. But we have no records of the women themselves from Kilrush, though we have from many other women who have told us their stories and how it affected them. So eventually it closed, and the children were sent in the main to Shanross Abbey. There were records, maybe some children and some pregnant women maybe went to the county home in the early years afterwards. So I can't say for definite that every girl who got pregnant in Clare and who couldn't be looked after by her family or in a private nursing home, that she was sent to Roscrea, Shanross Abbey, but certainly a number of them were, and I know that anecdotally as well as through records. And the picture I have here is a picture of one. It's on the left-hand side. I have the picture of the instructions from the Board of Health, and we have the instruction or the suggestion from the department that they be sent to Shanross Abbey. And we have in red accepted, so everything was accepted by the Board of Health. Really, they washed their hands of the problem. It was one they didn't want to have, you know, and there were difficult times, and money was hard to find, and rates were, you know, difficult to collect and all the rest of it. But there certainly was a severe lack of compassion shown to these women and their children, and the unfortunate result of it was in what Dr. Coonahan called the appalling death rate, as well as all the other misery that went with that. Okay, that's my talk for the decade of commemoration, and it is a different view of what happened in 1922. They had great aspirations, they wanted to do good things, but for many reasons it just didn't happen. Thank you.